First up, we got Salt by Adam Roberts, which is his first novel, came out in the year 2000. Pretty politically prescient science fiction work that has its roots deep in a particular part of the genre, specifically Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. This is, in some sense, maybe even a retelling of The Dispossessed with a different coat of paint. Slightly different politics, although a lot of the same stakes as Dispossessed, just amped up to a higher level of violence and intensity. I liked it a lot. It's about a colonizing mission from Earth to seed human beings on this planet that's called Salt because it's like Arrakis and Dune, except instead of sand, it's covered in white salt. And different human cultures all strung together in these colony pods on the spaceship that have commerce across the pods, cultural contact and occasionally cultural conflict all land together and have to eke out an existence in conflict again with one another or in collaboration. And there are confederacies of these little nation states that form once planetfall is achieved. And on the voyage to Salt, there have been cracks forming in this social facade of conviviality and diplomacy between the two major warring factions. This isn't really a spoiler. They end up becoming warring factions. There's a kind of liberal, democratic, capitalist society that superficially resembles our own, that is really hierarchical and based in more traditional values of patronage and patrimony and property rights. And there's an anarchist culture whose name I don't recall that is more maternalistic. Paternity is not an existing idea in this culture, or certainly not one that is valued at all. Most people don't even know who the fathers of specific children are. They're raised communally. Property values are non-existent, and social contracts are formed in this ad hoc, improvised way. There's nothing contractually binding in any social relation at all. And there's no centralized governance either. So each person could and at times does serve as an emissary for their culture at large. And the culture is so decentralized that it's not really a culture whatsoever. It's just autonomous individualist people working as these atoms in a barely coherent larger whole. These cultures are so alien to one another that when they try to establish better diplomatic relations, or when the capitalist society tries to build a bridge with this anarchist society, the depth of misunderstanding is so incredibly deep that not only is diplomacy close to impossible, it leads to tragic and violent consequences. I think it's a really good book. It's pretty funny. It's quite violent and quite dark, but it also has a great biting edge of satire, especially in the portrayal of the grand patriarch of this capitalist society, who is pompous and obsessed with ideas of masculine virtue. He prides himself for his culture being this forward-thinking bastion of Enlightenment values, while they still charge medical insurance of their citizens, and you can literally buy votes, and it's so commercialized that democracy is just this sham, and they commit all these grave acts of human rights violations, and they're totally censorious, and there's no free press, but he buys into his own rhetoric and on some level. It's quite funny. I thought it was a really sophisticated book. I liked it quite a bit. It didn't attain to masterpiece status, but I think that it's a worthy successor of Dispossessed. And also, I think was pretty prescient of the political scene. Roberts pulled something off that was pretty remarkable. I endorse the book, certainly. I think you should read it. Then I read The Abominable Snowmen by Eric Norman, which is a vintage book about the Yeti and the Sasquatch phenomenon that came out in the late 60s or early 70s. Yeah, 1969. I really like Bigfoot books. I'm starting to collect them. And these older Bigfoot books are pretty hard to find, so I was happy when I found it in Chiang Mai. It is not really worth talking about so much. I've talked about Bigfoot a lot on this channel. I have a standing interest in it. I tend to think that it's more likely to be a real animal than to not be a real animal. That's my take on it. I have a video that I put out on this channel that is about an hour long. Some would argue about 45 minutes too long, talking about my enthusiasm for Bigfoot. Anyway, this book sucks. It's full of misrepresentations and exaggerations. It's also filled with these weird phrenology things, this race science. And that was a cold shower to take to recognize something that should have been probably apparent to me, or I should have been able to guess that this was the case, that the proto-early scientific interest in Sasquatch, not just from pulp sensationalists like Eric Norman, but by the scientists that were interested in it, was heavily colored by race science. The book sucks, but there was, interestingly, a nugget of commonality between the eyewitness testimony back then and the eyewitness testimony now. That's the part of the Sasquatch thing that I'm most interested in. So there was a little bit of stuff to chew on there. Do I recommend going out and finding a copy? No, I don't. Red as Blood by Tanith Lee is Tanith Lee's retellings of old fairy tales from around the world with a feminist cast, feminist retelling, a lot of Prince Charming narratives that are inverted. So Prince Charming is a lurking menace. And that sounds formulaic. Maybe it is a little formulaic, but it's Tanith Lee, so of course the writing is going to be great. This is, of the Tanith Lee books that I've read, I think the one that I'm least pumped on. It's sort of right down the middle, round 7 out of 10, but there's a couple stories in there that are truly great. The final story, let me see if I can find the name of it. Beauty, which is her version of Beauty and the Beast, I think is its own little great kick-ass SF novella that I think, this is my theory, was the kernel of a larger novel that she intended to write, but she never got around to it because there's a lot of buildup of world building and characterization and then this big info dump for the last bit of it. And it all does work because it's Tanith Lee, she's a good writer, but I feel like there was a lot of room to expand that out into a larger work. That is my favorite story. I also really liked Wolfland, her retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. Those two are my favorite stories. There's a couple in there that I think were filler-ish, but overall it's good. It's really deep and dark and violent and goth. It's so incredibly goth. She also did these drawings, these heavy ink, almost woodcut drawings for a lot of the stories that are great. I do recommend it. It's not as heavy-hitting as the other Tanith Lees that I've read, but I did enjoy it. I do approve. Then I read The Space Merchants by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. I read Pohl's 2011 Sprite Remix version. When Space Merchants was first published in 1952, it was a massive bestseller and it was a huge influence on the genre at large. A lot of people considered it the best piece of science fiction to have been published to that time, including by people like Alfred Bester. I think I would include it in a list of canonical dystopian books, but I wouldn't include it in the vaunted top 15 list. I don't think so. I had mixed feelings about it. I don't know how much of the criticism can be levied just on Frederick Pohl because of the 2011 rewrite. There were bits of it that I thought were quite poor. He takes company names of known corporations when it was originally published and then replaces them with more contemporary companies like Walmart, as if this is going to make it fresher and more relatable. I found that really, really corny. And some of the subject matter doesn't age particularly well. It takes place in a future where state power has been largely replaced, or at least critically infiltrated by and compromised by corporate power. And society is stratified into an elite of marketing professionals and the main industry in this world is the advertising of products and proletarianized consumers who are called consumers, who are manual laborers and are the subjects of all of this marketing. And the protagonist is a marketing executive at one of the major marketing shogunates. There are these two. It almost has like a Philip Dick feel from Ubik. There are these two big marketing houses that are the two biggest that have been in this Cold War with one another for many years. And this firm that the protagonist works for is granted the development contract for the entirety of the planet of Venus and the whole colonization effort that will be miserable for the colonists. And this guy has to come up with a way to pitch the consumer population on this, embarking on this project is this kind of homesteading frontiersman, spiritually edifying, masculine thing. And then things go belly up when he is targeted in a monkey-wrenching campaign from the other rival marketing agency and finds himself looking through the other end of the telescope at society and being plunged into a starkly new scenario in his life. There are bits of satire that are kind of eternal, and they do work. There's something about the novel that I did find a little janky, and it's the jankiness of the fix-up novel. This is a fix-up novel. There's also a jankiness probably related to the fact that it was co-written by two people who have pretty different writing styles. I much prefer Kornbluth to Pohl. I've read not a ton from both Pohl and Kornbluth. The bits that I believe were written by Kornbluth were my favorites, that are notably darker. And there's a bit in here that is startlingly violent and crazy that I think is Kornbluth. Kornbluth was fundamentally a pissed off individual, and that's why a lot of his material is, it has longer legs and more longevity with me, and I think that it's funnier. Pohl has this dime store George Carlin sense of humor that grates on me, and this is me just attributing certain parts of it to my speculation of who wrote it. It's also interesting to see how the political stakes have shifted around, or where who would plant specific flags on certain issues around ecology. It is in that way pretty anachronistic. In a bunch of ways it's pretty anachronistic. I think that Kornbluth's short stories are actually stronger than Space Merchants, or Gravy Planet as it was originally called, even though this is a way more famous and broadly read work. And then I think we will wrap on The Stone Gods by Jeanette Winterson, which was a weird serendipity to read right after Space Merchants because it bears such an incredible, stark resemblance to the plot of Space Merchants, at least in one section of it. And it's a difficult book to talk about. The Patreon video is, I think, about half an hour long. There's so much to discuss. Jeanette Winterson is a modernist writer who dabbles in science fiction and has an interesting approach to writing. And I don't know how much science fiction she has read, but a lot of it reads like amateurish treatments of things that have forerun Stone Gods thematically in the genre. And as a consequence, a lot of the stuff in there reads as these regurgitated, rehashed, trite tropes, and it gives the whole thing this feeling of genre dilettantism. It is hard to praise as a work of science fiction because it's derivative, I think accidentally derivative of a lot of stuff like Space Merchants and like Asimov that come before it. But as a work of experimental fiction, it in parts works spectacularly well. It begins with a plot that is a lot like the Space Merchants. It's a similar dystopian future where the world is hyper-commercialized and something like immortality has become attainable. You can fix your age at a specific point, and consequently everybody is in their 20s for the most part and is sexually promiscuous. But there is a bottleneck with the population in terms of resources, so they have to go colonize a new planet. And just like in Space Merchants, it's going to be grueling. And the protagonist is a PR worker for the state who is given the task of drumming up this campaign to popularize the notion of a colonization effort, even though it is going to be so incredibly difficult. And then they do go on this colonizing mission along with a sentient robot, and the protagonist gets wrapped up in the life of this robot following the mission. And then it goes on to places that I won't really talk about because I don't want to spoil it if you do end up reading it. There's a very rough 3-act structure, and the book harmonizes with itself. And I can't say more without spoiling, but it's a series of bookends. Winterson had or has an interesting writing style where she wrote this, at least, in snippets. She wrote in short jaunts, and then when it came close to the publication date, she arranged everything into something like a linear narrative, although it's definitely not that exactly. There are huge stylistic variations between these chunks and between the different books, and there are many different themes that interlace one with the other, and also certain sections that don't relate to the rest of the story that point out into the ether. Altogether, it is a kind of heady, modernist, difficult, chewy work. It's a pretty wild book, and it's a mashup of so many different things that I'm finding it really challenging to put it into a nutshell. I would say read it if you're interested in modernist fiction and experimental fiction. As a science fiction novel, I don't know that it works. I think it's a little too fragmentary and, like I said, a little bit too reminiscent of things and doesn't do anything that's exactly inventive with those themes. But there are certain passages of it that are some of the best writing, some of the best prose that I've ever come across in a science fiction book. So I do recommend it with a bunch of asterisks. All of these books have longer reviews on the Patreon. The Patreon is $5. There's hours and hours and hours and hours of content up there at this point, so I think it's a pretty decent deal. There's a link to that in the description. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.